Hi everyone, my name is Professor Jorge Guzman, and I'm here to talk to you about the impact of COVID-19 on US entrepreneurship. To do this, let me tell you about a project I'm doing with Kathy Facio, who's at Boston University, and Scott Stern at MIT. Before we get there, let me just emphasize how important entrepreneurship is for the United States. There's three reasons usually that I really think about that entrepreneurship is critical, and therefore we would worry if COVID-19 is impacting it. The first, entrepreneurship is the engine of innovation in the United States. Second, that innovation in turn drives economic growth and shared well-being for all. And third, it's not only general economic growth that it drives, but also entrepreneurship is the centerpiece of local neighborhood vibrancy that connects us all socially to the people around us and the communities we're part of. What we did with my co-authors is we tapped into this broader infrastructure that we have created called the Startup Cartography Project. This is a project done together with RJ Andrews at Info with Trust and Yupeng Liu who's here at Columbia and who was also a research assistant in this analysis. In the Startup Cartography Project, our goal is to measure entrepreneurship everywhere and anywhere in the United States. Find every single company that's created, understand its quality, understand its precise location, and to do that, we had this insight, I guess, or this idea that we're going to find out the legal registrations of companies. And so while companies get started at different points and there's certainly founders agreements and other things, what we thought was, well, one easy way to study firm formation is to find the legal founding moment of the company. And so if you or anybody else start a company, it's not only when you choose to start it, but often you have to go down to the Secretary of State and create a legal document that is sort of a little C, a partnership. We work with every single Secretary of State all across the United States for 50 states and develop connection to try to get the data for all the companies created in those locations. Here's what we do then is map all the companies and get to the quality and quantity across time and location. So here's our mapping, for example, for the quality of quantity entrepreneurship in New York City, in Manhattan, and what we see is a very common pattern that we're all used to seeing in Midtown. There's a lot of activity, then a lot less sort of in the Lower East Side. Then once you get to downtown, there's a lot of activity again, as well as across the bridge, sort of to Brooklyn and across the tunnel to New Jersey. So this is the broader infrastructure. Now, what we realized was that we could tap into this project to try to understand how is business formation, how is this company registration process changing today? And we could work not with everybody, but with some states and secretaries of state where we are able to see the data. It's almost in real time and see if they're getting more or less registrations and why. Okay, so let me give you the first takeaway that we got from this analysis was that there's actually been a very big drop. There's been a massive drop in entrepreneurship since the COVID-19 lockdowns. We did a simple study in New York, and we found that there's about 11,000 missing companies, and they're more likely to be locally oriented. And so here's the graph that I want you to take home. What we have plotted here is in the dotted line, we plot the number of companies registered in 2019 by day in New York State. In the solid line, the blue line, we plot the number of companies registered by day in 2020. And we adjust for kind of day of the week, etc. And what you see is that these two lines basically look the same before the pandemic kind of hit us, but that once it hits us, and particularly once the school and restaurant closure begins, we see a massive drop in total for formation in New York State compared to the prior year. The drop is, at its lowest point, it's about a 66% difference, about 2/3 difference between the top and the bottom. But it's narrowing over time, so perhaps we'll talk about more of that towards the end. So first takeaway, though, there's been a huge drop in firm formation after the COVID-19 crisis. This is the total number. Now, This impact has been higher on local firms, which are focused on local economic activities such as your neighborhood and your local kind of shops. And it's been less targeted at growth-oriented firms. So one thing you can think of is it registered locally or is it registered in Delaware, but just doing business locally? And we see a difference of about twice as much on the local ones versus Delaware. We see this drop in every borough. For example, in New York City, this is Manhattan, this is Brooklyn, and I could show you a lot of other locations and you'd see the same pattern. We also see it in other places besides New York. Here's Washington State. You see a huge drop as well as a narrowing of the gap, yet still there's a substantial difference. When we look at other data outside business registration, we actually see the same thing as well. And so, for example, John Haltiwanger has done some analysis with census data and EIN filings, and over there they see a drop of up to 40% in the total number of firms created. Even in other countries, so this is some analysis from Denmark, we continue to see this emerging gap in entrepreneurship based on the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the first takeaway that I really want you to think about. There's been a huge drop in entrepreneurship since COVID-19, particularly in the timing since the lockdowns, though obviously the cause is the pandemic and the lockdowns are just a consequence of that. They're about, when we look at how big is the gap and we add it up for New York, it's about 11,000 new companies that are missing. They're more likely to be locally oriented. The second thing I'd like you to know is to get some perspective on how bad this is compared to other crises that you might remember, such as 9/11, the financial crisis, or Hurricane Katrina. Here's the 9/11 effect, and you're going to see, right? So what you see is a small drop, and actually it comes back to trend very quickly. So the drop is much less. It's about 20% here. It comes back to trend much quicker. Here's the fall. Here's the Great Recession. Again, you do see a drop, but the drop is much smaller. So what we see sort of in New York State, for example, these crises compared to these other two that were very consequential for New York as well, seems just a lot bigger in its impact on entrepreneurship. Now let me show you a different natural disaster, and this is Hurricane Katrina in state registrations in Louisiana. Again, we see a huge drop in total registrations around the timing of the hurricane, but actually afterwards it comes back on trend. And so it seems like the effect we're documenting here seems a lot bigger than these three other crises that we would think are kind of pretty consequential for the United States over the last 20 years. Here's where you can see all of them together and just to put it in perspective, and you really see this difference in this white graph between the blue and dotted line just being much bigger than the other three. Now the third thing I want you to think about, though, so that's the first two takeaways. The third one is really about this narrowing of the gap. And here we're a little bit more optimistic. Maybe you've been thinking about that all along. You've been thinking, yes, the gap was huge immediately after the crisis and lockdown. The whole country stopped. But it seems to be narrowing now, right? It seems to be narrowing here in New York. And I showed you Washington, it was narrowing there as well. And you'd be right. There's actually some cause for optimism here. Here's Virginia, where we see a gap, but we actually see it completely narrowed by now. Here it's Kentucky, where we sort of see the same pattern, a huge gap at the moment of the crisis, but then a lot of narrowing afterwards. And here's Missouri, again, the same pattern. And so there seems to be an improvement. I hope this signals recovery. We usually like entrepreneurship as a very positive signal, because entrepreneurs, when they're choosing to start a company, they're fundamentally thinking about the future. And because they're thinking about the future and they're choosing to start a company focused on those future opportunities, we hope that signals some on-the-ground intention and optimism on the possibilities of future communities across the United States. And so that's all I wanted to tell you. Here's our contact. I hope that brought some perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on U.S. entrepreneurship. and in turn on the US economy. Thank you so much, and please reach out, and I hope to hear from you soon.